Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we really get into some complex source material, stuff that, honestly, you often need a guide for. Our goal is always to make it surprisingly clear, maybe even fascinating, and definitely something you can think about. Today, wow, we are tackling something pretty foundational, high-level theological architecture, you could say. We're wrestling with a huge cosmic question. What does it actually take? What are the absolute non-negotiables for an atonement sacrifice? And specifically, we're diving deep into sources that look at why a created being, even say the highest angel, just doesn't work, why it's fundamentally insufficient for that role.
That's a really crucial starting point. And it sets up the core idea running through all the material you sent over. We basically have to think about existence in, let's say, two profoundly different buckets. On one side, you've got the first God, the second God. They exist outside creation, separate. Then on the other side, there's everything created. Angels, humans, space, time itself, all of it. And as the sources are absolutely emphatic on this, all created beings, angels included, are stuck within the limits of space and time. Their thoughts, their potential, their whole being, really, it all depends on the divine. It's contingent. And this absolute limit, this boundary on created existence, is the bedrock reason why an angel can't pay what amounts to an infinite price.
Okay, so our mission today for this deep dive is to navigate this really intricate theological map, you might say. And we want to pull out four specific, very detailed reasons these sources give. They're all connected, interdependent, and these four pillars, together, they aim to show why only the second God, the Son, the Christ figure, can properly fill that role of sacrifice, and why doing so is essential for cosmic stability and also for proving divine love in a way that convinces everyone, not just Adam, but the whole created order.
Yeah, it's really an exploration into divine causality, isn't it? The sacrifice isn't presented as just, balancing the books legally. It's framed as the one single event needed to permanently align the entire moral physics of the cosmos. And if the wrong type of being tries to step into that role, well, the whole system, which is governed by this commandment, it risks total collapse.
Okay, right. Let's start unpacking this then. And the sources suggest we shouldn't start with the law itself, but maybe surprisingly, with relationships. With this fundamental issue of, well, divine affection, who loves whom and how love is proven.
It's exactly. And this is the first major roadblock for any created being trying to be the sacrifice. The core argument here that the sources lay out is that angels, sure, they're beloved creations, but they are not the primary direct object of the first God's love. So sacrificing an angel just fundamentally fails. It doesn't demonstrate the depth of divine love that the situation demands for atonement.
That sounds almost harsh or incredibly narrow, especially when the sources can talking about the cosmos being governed by love. If the first God only loves the second God directly, how can anyone else, any created being, really trust that the love they receive is genuine, not just some leftover feeling?
That's the big philosophical question, isn't
Yeah.
it? And the sources tackle it directly. They're incredibly explicit. The first God only loves the second God directly. There's that line you mentioned, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. That right there establishes the eternal, unique relationship. Direct, unconditional, absolute love. It's that bond. Any love that flows out to created beings and angels, humans, whoever is transmitted through the second God, it's like an ordered cascade. So angels, just by their nature as created beings, they're in a secondary spot, a mediated position in this hierarchy of affection. They're not the primary beloved.
And this structure, this hierarchy, it has immediate, pretty stark consequences for anyone who breaks the main rule, the governing commandment, which the sources link directly to disobeying the second God, right? If created beings choose not to follow him, not to submit to the structure of love.
Then they effectively step outside the formal system of receiving that governing love. That's exactly right. The sources basically treat disobedience as rejecting the only channel through which God's governing love flows to them. Now, that doesn't mean the Creator stops caring entirely. There's still perhaps a general love, maybe a profound pity for the created thing itself. But for the disobedient one, that love ends up expressing itself in a tragic way. And that's where this concept comes in, the idea of reducing them to non-existence, often pictured as being consumed by fire.
Okay, let's pause on that for a second. Reducing to non-existence. What does that actually mean according to these texts? Is it just annihilation, like poof, gone? Or is it more about being removed from the system of grace, the governance of love?
The sources seem to lean much more towards the second idea. It's presented as the final, irrevocable granting of the criminal's own deepest desire, freedom from God's rule. Think about it. If God's rule is fundamentally based on the commandment of love, then being reduced to non-existence is the ultimate escape from the governance of love. It's a complete stopping of their structured existence within space-time as they knew it. Because they chose separation from the source of life, their inevitable end, the text suggests, is to be consumed by the fire of God's holiness, which is just incompatible with their rebellious state. So it's framed, paradoxically, as a final, maybe sorrowful expression of love, letting the creature have what it ultimately wanted. Total freedom from God's influence, even if that means its own oblivion.
Wow, okay, that reframes the whole idea of eternal penalty. Not arbitrary punishment, but a kind of final consequence of rejecting the only thing that sustains existence. So bringing that back to the sacrifice. If the only truly primarily beloved one is the second God, then any real proof of love has to involve him.
Precisely. The demonstration has to carry the absolute maximum weight, the highest possible value. If the first God sacrifices, say, an angel, just a created being, someone who receives love secondhand to save Adam, who was also a created being, well, it doesn't really prove anything profound about the first God's own commitment to creation. It could easily look like just, shuffling assets, trading one created resource for another. And the sources warn explicitly that the rest of creation would totally misunderstand the seriousness of the commandment and the very nature of God's love if that kind of swap happened.
Right. It wouldn't have the necessary emotional punch or the deep relational significance needed to secure the permanent trust of all creation.
Exactly. The only path, according to these texts, to prove divine love absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt for all eternity, is for God to sacrifice God's own self. The first God giving up the second God, the only entity that is truly and directly beloved. That's the only way the demonstration becomes absolute, infinite, and eternally clear to every single created being. Only that secures their love, and through their love, their willing obedience. Sacrificing a creature for another creature just means the ultimate price wasn't paid by the ultimate authority. It falls short.
That makes a lot of sense. And it flows directly into our second point, doesn't it? If the sacrifice has to be the ultimate target of love, it also needs to be completely secure, completely stable in its own moral standing. So we move from affection to stability. Why an angel's free will, according to these sources, makes them fundamentally unsuitable, unstable, really, as a perfect eternal substitute.
Yes, this gets into the very nature of created perfection, or maybe created incompleteness. The sources argue quite strongly that angels, even the good ones, are not incapable of sinning again. Why? Because their free will isn't finished yet. It's not fully complete. They are still inherently somewhat unstable entities within the limits of their created existence.
And we're talking here about the non-fallen angels, right? The ones who didn't go with Hellel or Satan. Even they still carry some possibility, however small, of sinning in the future. What does that mean, incomplete free will?
It implies they lack absolute, unwavering certainty. The sources suggest angels still hold some reservations, maybe skepticism is the right word, towards the first God and the commandment. Now, this isn't the active, hateful rebellion of the fallen ones. It's more like having some deep, unanswered questions lingering in their nature. They haven't fully entered into the truth that the second God embodies and demonstrates. And until this deep-seated skepticism, this question about the absolute goodness and trustworthiness of God's decree is completely, utterly extinguished, the possibility of doubt remains. And where there's doubt, the possibility of sin, however remote, still exists.
So their current obedience is based on what they've seen their choices so far. But it hasn't been totally sealed by perfect, maybe transcendent knowledge. They're still, in a way, calculating the odds.
That's a good way to put it. They're operating on a kind of informed trust, maybe even high confidence, but it's not yet confirmed. Absolute eternal knowledge. The commandment says, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, the angels obey, but they haven't yet witnessed the ultimate test of that commandment. They haven't seen the ultimate consequence for breaking it played out in the most dramatic way possible. They need some kind of cosmic confirmation to eliminate that final bit of uncertainty, that strategic doubt.
And what do the sources say provides that final, overwhelming, permanent proof? The thing that finally completes or seals their free will?
It's identified very specifically, the cross. And that event, coupled with the resurrection and the transformation of the first fruit, the believers who follow the second God, this whole sequence, this event, demonstrates publicly in space and time that God's love and God's justice, meaning the entire system governed by the commandment, are completely genuine, eternally reliable, and ultimately triumphant. It's the ultimate proof that the rules governing the cosmos aren't arbitrary. They're built on absolute truth.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that confirmation. Why does seeing suffering and sacrifice on the cross and then the victory over death, why does that resolve angelic skepticism?
Because it directly answers their deepest existential questions. questions about the real cost of obedience and the true severity of breaking the rules. You see, before the cross, they could theoretically wonder, is God really committed to this commandment, even if it costs God everything? Is the penalty for disobedience really as absolute as God says? But when they witness the second God, God's self, paying the ultimate infinite price for the breaking of the commandment, and then they see the subsequent victory over death and the transformation that follows, well, any lingering doubt they might have had about the truthfulness, the reliability, the sheer seriousness of the divine system, it just evaporates completely.
It makes the abstract law totally concrete, undeniable, real.
Exactly. And once the angels grasp that profound truthfulness of the commandment, demonstrated so powerfully, their skepticism vanishes. Poof. They then joyfully, fully submit to the second God's rule. And crucially, the possibility of them sinning again is extinguished. 0% chance. The sources argue that only then is their free will finally completed. They transform from beings who could potentially fall into beings eternally confirmed in goodness and obedience.
Okay, and here's where the link between Adam's situation and the angels becomes so important, right? Because we're not just talking about saving humanity. We're talking about stabilizing the entire cosmos, including the angelic realm. If the angels are inherently unstable until the commandment's truth is proven in this ultimate way, then the sacrifice itself has to be performed by someone who is already perfectly stable, someone whose goodness is eternally secure. An angel can't possibly atone for sin because they themselves still carry that tiny seed, that possibility of future sin within them.
You've hit it exactly. A creature that is still, even theoretically, capable of questioning the law cannot possibly be the perfect substitute required to satisfy the demands of that very law. The sacrifice has to be absolutely spotless, eternally secure in its moral alignment, unchanging, immutable. And since even the good angels still possess that small, maybe infinitesimal, but non-zero possibility of doubt, that lingering skepticism, they just can't be the eternal substitute. The substitute isn't just about paying a debt, it's about solidifying the moral foundation of the entire universe forever. And only a divine, fully secured, unchanging entity can possibly fulfill that role. The sacrifice has to guarantee that the angels never face the need for an atonement of their own down the line.
The stakes are just astronomical. If the sacrifice wasn't perfect in this way, the whole celestial order, even the loyal angels who resisted hell's rebellion, they could, theoretically, eventually fall prey to doubt and chaos themselves.
That's the implication, yes. The integrity of the law, the very stability of God's rule, rests entirely on the integrity of the sacrifice. If the sacrifice itself is potentially flawed or changeable, which any created being, defined by its existence within time and space, inherently is, then the law it's meant to uphold is also revealed as potentially changeable or flawed. It undermined everything. So the sacrifice had to be performed, and performed perfectly, by the right entity to prevent a potential second cosmic rebellion bubbling up from that remaining angelic skepticism.
Which brings us logically to the third pillar, and this one feels almost existential or maybe economic. It's about the valuation of the commandment itself and how its value directly impacts cosmic order. The sources seem to present it almost like a formula. The commandment's value is set by the value of the sacrifice needed to fix things when it's broken.
Yes, this is definitely the cosmic accounting section, you could say. It's very direct. Sin is defined simply as breaking the commandment of love. Okay. Now, the severity, the inviolability, the sheer weight of that commandment is measured, almost mathematically, by the value of the ransom required to cover the cost of breaking it. And the penalty for breaking it is absolute, being cast out by God, leading to spiritual and existential death, total separation.
Right. So let's play out the thought experiment the sources imply. What happens if an angel, even a really high-ranking, incredibly valuable angel, is the sacrifice for sin? What does that do to the perceived value of the commandment that governs everything in space-time?
It instantly crashes the value. That's a catastrophic outcome. If the sacrifice is just a creature, however exalted, then the supreme law governing all existence is immediately perceived as having a low, finite value, the value of one angel. And this, according to the sources, is where the entire structure of the created universe starts to fray and unravel.
But why? Why does assigning it a lower value automatically lead to destruction? Is it just that creatures lose respect?
It's more fundamental than just respect. Creatures, the sources seem to assume, are inherently, well, maybe transactional or self-interested at some level, especially post-fall. God established the commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself, as the absolute binding principle for every interaction everywhere in space-time. If creatures look at this principle and see that the cost of breaking it was relatively low, one angel's worth, they will, rationally perhaps, treat it lightly. They'll do the calculation. The cost of breaking the rule, finite. versus the potential gain for themselves.
Yeah.
Immediate. And inevitably, they'll break it. Often.
And the sources specifically warn that this widespread breaking of the commandment leads directly to, what do they call it, lawless oppression.
That's the term. Lawless oppression becomes the default state of a universe where the governing principle has been devalued. It's inevitable. Creatures will just trample each other. It's a stark image. If the ultimate cost of transgression is finite and manageable, but the reward of selfishness is right there, the system just can't sustain itself. The weak get crushed by the strong. Chaos, suffering, injustice. That becomes the norm.
And the sources seem to push it even further, making an almost unbelievable claim. They suggest that if the commandment's validity itself collapses, like if God's word is shown to be cheap or maybe even false, then creation itself, the fabric of space-time, either couldn't have started or it will just dissolve.
That's the really deep insight here, yeah. It connects the moral law to physical existence. The argument is that the very existence of creation hangs on the absolute truthfulness and the eternal, binding nature of God's word, which the commandment perfectly embodies. If God sets a law, but then accepts a cheap payment to uphold it when it's broken, it sends a message. God's word isn't ultimate truth. It's negotiable. And if God's word is ultimately false or unreliable, then creation is fundamentally cut off from its only source of life, order, and truth. It loses its anchor. And the consequence is dissolution, returning to nothingness. So to ensure the survival of space-time, let alone its moral functioning, the commandment must have the highest possible value. Infinite value.
So the economic necessity, or this valuation, isn't just about settling a debt. It's about preserving existence itself. God had to set the commandment's value equal to God's own value.
Precisely. There was no other way to make it stick, eternally. By making God's self the ransom, the second God paying the price, the commandment instantly achieves infinite, absolute, non-negotiable value. It sets an eternal precedent that cannot be challenged. It ensures, the sources argue, that no creature can ever again rationally dare to trample his neighbor, because the cost of doing so is now understood to be cosmic, infinite, and borne by God himself. The texts are starkly clear. God deliberately set the value of the commandment as heavy as God's self, precisely to ensure the eternal preservation of creatures and the stability of the entire creation.
That's a staggering thought. Connecting the infinite nature of the second God directly to the ongoing viability of the physical and moral universe. Okay, so we've covered the target of love, the need for absolute stability, and this crucial idea of cosmic valuation. But there's one more piece, a final requirement that seems very specific to the human experience. It's the necessity of actually experiencing the cursed flesh, Adam's unique burden.
Right. This fourth pillar deals with the specific context needed for the demonstration to be fully effective. The argument is, angels simply lack the particular profound difficulty in keeping the commandment that Adam and his descendants face. Why? Because of their physical condition after the fall. Therefore, the sacrifice must demonstrate the commandment's truthfulness under the absolute worst, most difficult conditions imaginable.
Let's define that cursed flesh idea more clearly. It stems from Adam's sin, right? The consequence where the ground yields thorns and thistles. And the sources interpret that metaphorically, linking the external hardship to an internal spiritual and moral struggle, the lust of the flesh, or that phrase, no soul.
Exactly. That internal conflict becomes the defining characteristic of Adam's lineage, of humanity. Humans are in this state of constant inner warfare. They simply cannot, through their own willpower alone, consistently keep the commandment. Their cursed body, their fallen nature, constantly generates desires, urges, weaknesses. These are the thorns and thistles that actively pull them away from loving God and neighbor. Adam, and by extension humanity, is genuinely handicapped in this post-fall reality. It's a constant struggle.
Angels, though, they don't have this specific problem. They don't possess this kind of cursed physical body, so they don't experience those same lusts of the flesh. Now, they still need grace to choose good, as we discussed with their incomplete free will, but they aren't fighting that same daily physical internal battle that humans are.
Correct. The struggle, while real for them perhaps in terms of choosing obedience over doubt, is inherently different, maybe easier in that specific physical sense. So if an angel were to perfectly demonstrate obedience, sure, it proves they can obey through grace. That's fine for them. But the ultimate sacrifice needs to prove that the commandment is valid and keepable for the creature living under the curse. If the final, definitive proof of the commandment's possibility comes from a being who has never felt the relentless pull of those internal thorns and thistles, it wouldn't fully land. It wouldn't completely validate the commandment for Adam's descendants who are living that struggle every day.
Ah, okay. So the point of the ultimate sacrifice isn't just to pay the penalty price. It's also, critically, to provide undeniable, almost empathetic proof. Proof that the commandment can be kept, but only through grace, even when someone is living in the most compromised, difficult physical and spiritual state possible.
That's exactly it. Because angels lack that fundamental internal fleshly conflict, demonstrating perfect obedience through them wouldn't certainly prove, as the sources put it, the commandment's validity to the descendants of Adam. The demonstration has to be made under the absolute worst-case conditions to make the truth undeniable for the very creature struggling with that perpetual internal chaos.
And this leads to that really profound conclusion that the second God decided, apparently even before creation happened, decided to actually take on that specific cursed human flesh to experience the state of being Adam.
Yes, the incarnation isn't presented as just a reaction to sin. It's framed as an intentional, necessary part of the plan from the beginning. The second God deliberately chose to become Adam to become a neighbor to humanity, living among them, and, crucially, to keep the commandment perfectly while residing in that state of the cursed body. This single act proves two vital things at once. One, that the commandment itself is true and good, and two, that it is possible to follow it through God's grace, even when surrounded by and experiencing the thorns and thistles.
So the entire act becomes more than just a divine payment. It's a cosmic lesson, a demonstration, a pedagogy, performed by the only one who could possibly meet all four of these incredibly specific requirements.
And it also serves as the essential, visible display of God's love, which is needed to enable a response. The sources really emphasize this point. Creatures can't genuinely love God back, and therefore can't truly obey the commandment of love, until they first understand the sheer depth of God's love for them. And the cross, that public moment where the second God experiences separation, being forsaken by the first God, becomes the ultimate, visible proof of that love. It shows love willing to bear infinite cost. And it's this display that then empowers creatures, especially those struggling in the cursed body, to respond with genuine gratitude, trust, and obedience. Without that initial, visible act of love, performed in the worst conditions, the whole chain reaction of creaturely love and obedience just breaks down. The commandment remains practically impossible for them.
Wow, okay, that really does tie all four of those pillars together into one, frankly, stunningly coherent picture. Let's try and quickly synthesize this for everyone listening. We've got four key reasons why only the second God would work. One, the sacrifice had to be the primary object of the first God's love to prove infinite affection. Two, it had to be perfectly stable, morally immutable to guarantee the law forever. Three, its value had to equal God's own value to uphold cosmic order and prevent universal collapse. And four, finally, it had to specifically involve enduring the cursed state of Adam's flesh to provide verifiable proof to those struggling in that exact state.
And the overarching goal, which the sources reveal is quite elegant, is this profound efficiency in God's plan. Adam's redemption, dealing with human sin, becomes intrinsically linked to the confirmation and the final completion of the angel's free will. By dealing with Adam's sin using an infinite price, God simultaneously stabilizes the entire loyal angelic host. It solves both problems at once.
So that public display of love, the second God sacrificing self, that's the ultimate trigger. It removes that lingering skepticism we talked about in the angels. The cosmic proof the angels needed is actually delivered through the atonement designed for humans.
It is the ultimate confirmation for them, yes. By witnessing the commandment upheld at such an infinite cost, the angels finally grasp its absolute seriousness, and they see the absolute depth of God's commitment to his own word. That realization is what reduces their own possibility of doubt and therefore sin down to zero, permanently. The sources even suggest that because the loyal angels had already passed their big test, resisting Hellel's initial temptation, they are confirmed in their goodness simply by witnessing the grandeur and the cost of God's self-sacrifice. Their free will is completed, securing their eternal state, potentially without them needing to endure the same kind of physical suffering that Adam's lineage faces.
Which means the entire created order, everything existing only within space and time, effectively owes its continued existence and its moral stability to the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of that divine self-sacrifice, which was apparently planned before the cosmos even began.
The conclusion just seems inescapable based on these texts. If an angel, or any created being for that matter, had been judged a good enough substitute, creatures would simply never have grasped the true, infinite depth of divine love. It wouldn't have registered. And if creatures cannot perceive and then respond to that infinite love, they cannot possibly fulfill the commandment of love, which is the fundamental operating system for space-time. The universe would be stuck being governed by a cheapened, breakable law. That guarantees lawless oppression and ultimately inevitable doom. The whole fabric of reality, morally and perhaps even physically, hinges on that infinite price being paid by the right entity.
Exactly. It's quite a thought. That ultimate decision for the second God to become the sacrifice proved two massive foundational truths all at once. The absolute infinite value of the commandment breaking it unthinkable for anyone who truly gets the cost, and the absolute immeasurable depth of divine love reaching down into creation.
And that does raise a really important question, doesn't it? Something for you, the listener, to maybe just mull over. If the cost required just to validate the simplest, most fundamental law of the commandment of love was the self-sacrifice of the second God, what does that incredible cosmic weight mean for your perception today? Your perception of even the smallest act of breaking that law or the slightest disregard for a neighbor? If the price tag was literally infinite, how should you value that law in your own life?
Indeed. A powerful question to end on. We really encourage you to reflect on that, the immense weight assigned to this core principle of love, which these sources present as the fundamental necessity that anchored reality itself, even before time began. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.